Hi, good evening, everybody from Berlin. This is me, Dr. Finn, and today we will have, as we so often do with German history, an extremely difficult topic to discuss: the treatment of disabled people in Nazi Germany, namely the sterilizations of approximately 400,000 people. And this talk is going to precipitate one we will have later on the so-called T4 operation, the murder of approximately 300,000 people in Nazi-occupied Europe who were disabled or supposedly disabled. Now, this first occurred fairly openly under the guise of euthanasia and later under more clandestine circumstances. But the Nazis would have referred to this as a Gnadentod, or merciful death, of lebensunwerte Leben, lives unworthy of life. It's certainly not easy to talk about and learn about this, but I'm very glad that you're here with me to discuss the facts of a mass murder that really until quite recently wasn't so much acknowledged. There wasn't until recently so much written about it. Nevertheless, it's such a huge topic that I decided we will split this into two. So in this first part, I'll take us up to 1939. And the second part of this talk later will pertain to the years of the war, in fact, 1939 to 1945. But let's begin with a pre-Nazi history of what is known as eugenics. Now, the concept of eugenics predates the coining of the word, but the concept is of so-called selective breeding. In other words, improving the genetics of a given population by excluding those believed to be inferior and promoting those believed to be superior. And indeed, this sounds very much like a Nazi-esque ideology. The concept, of course, isn't only related to psychological or physical disability, but it's also related, of course, to race and to so-called miscegenation, or racial mixing. Well, in the 19th century, which of course was a truly terrible century in many ways for human rights, the concept of eugenics was put into practice in many countries. So those who were considered suitable were encouraged to reproduce, and for those who were not, unions, marital, sexual, were prohibited or strictly controlled. Now, forced sterilization became policy as well in the USA, Canada, Denmark, and Switzerland. In fact, a prominent Swiss psychiatrist, Eugen Bleuler, in the early 20th century summed up the feeling of many medical practitioners: the more severely burdened should not propagate. If we do nothing but make mental and physical cripples capable of propagating themselves, and the healthy stocks have to limit the number of their children because so much has to be done for the maintenance of others, if natural selection is generally suppressed, then unless we will get new measures, our race must rapidly deteriorate. Now, you might have heard of the so-called Model Eugenic Sterilization Law, also known as the Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924, which was hugely influential to discourse on eugenics in the 20th century. And by this law, around 7,000 people were forcibly sterilized in the state of Virginia for the protection and health of the state, as it was said. Victims of sterilization then included the mentally ill, people who were classed as insane, also criminals, people with epilepsy or alcoholism, people with different diseases or deformities, blindness, deafness, and also the economically vulnerable. This legislation was challenged in 1927 in the case of Buck versus Bell, in which an 18-year-old victim of incestuous rape, Carrie Buck, and her guardian filed a motion against John Hendren Bell, the superintendent of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and the Feeble-Minded, where Buck was a patient. Bell won the case and Buck was forcibly sterilized. She remained an avid reader and scholar until her death in 1983. This law then is especially associated with Virginia, but in fact of all the US states, California had subjected more residents to forcible sterilization than all other states combined by 1933. According to the book Sterilized by the State by the historians Hansen and King, Germany was considered in the 1920s to be unusually reluctant to introduce sterilization legislation. However, of course, pre-Nazi Germany is by no means innocent. There were certainly German proponents of eugenics long before Hitler took power. Alfred Plutz was a German physician and biologist who coined the term racial hygiene in 1895, and 10 years later he would found the German, later the International Society for Racial Hygiene, which posited that Germany should return to its supposed Nordic racial purity through selective reproduction. This society would have 1,300 members in Germany by 1933, as well as having branches in the UK, Sweden, USA, and the Netherlands. And Plutz himself, he would become ever more anti-Semitic throughout his life. In his earlier writings, he regarded the Jews, he said, as the second highest cultural race after Nordic Europeans, and stated the high aptitude of the Jews and their outstanding role in the progress of mankind, considering men such as Jesus, Spinoza, and Marx, has to be kindly acknowledged without hesitation. All of this anti-Semitism will vanish slowly in the light of scientific knowledge and a humane democracy. But Plutz would later abandon these ideas and become a fully fledged supporter of the Nazi Party, being awarded with a professorship in 1936. Emil Kraepelin is regarded as the founder of modern scientific psychiatry and psychopharmacology, as well as being a progressive reformer of the asylum system and an anti-death penalty advocate. He believed that psychiatric illness was the result of genetic malfunction, and in his later years he was particularly concerned with eugenics and again with this so-called racial hygiene. He's not so far away from the Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso in propagating the notion of the born criminal, referring to what he called inborn delinquency, although unlike Lombroso, he didn't believe a criminal could be recognized by their physical features. He talked about idiots, epileptics, psychopaths, criminals, prostitutes, and tramps who descend from alcoholic and syphilitic parents and transfer their inferiority to their offspring. He also talked of the so-called strong disposition of Jews toward nervous and mental disorders. Alfred Hoche was a German psychiatrist and Karl Binding was a jurist, working in an era in which suicide was illegal, rather difficult to enforce such a law, and in which euthanasia was illegal as well. They regrettably teamed up in 1920 and published the book Die Freigabe der Vernichtung lebensunwerten Lebens, which will prove hugely influential to the Nazis. The title in English means Allowing the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life. In this, the two authors argued that the killing of the comatose, the terminally ill, or the incurably mentally ill, people to whom they refer as mentally or intellectually dead, should not be seen as murder, but as a humane act of putting an end to suffering, and they wrote, "Perhaps one day we will come to the conclusion that the disposal of the mentally dead is not criminally or morally wrong, but a useful act." They also suggested that the state should be seen as an organism, as a human body, which, as every doctor knows, in the interests of the survival of the whole, gives up or discards parts which have become valueless or damaging. This book and this phrase, lebensunwerten, Leben, will become, as I say, hugely influential to the Nazis. Something to know, though, about Hoche is that his wife was Jewish, that he either left or was expelled from his professorship after the ascension of the Nazis to power, that one of his own relatives would be murdered in the Nazi operation known as T4, and that his death in 1943 was likely by suicide. It seems then that such ideas won ever more sympathy throughout the 1920s and early 30s in Germany as economic conditions worsened and faith in the Weimar Republic dwindled. And of course, this financial deterioration in particular will prompt the swing toward the right. But from 1930 on, Depression-era Germany will see substantial reductions in funding to psychiatric institutes, and the mentally ill will fall victim ever more to incarceration and often under brutal circumstances. It seems the feeling grew that the best of the early 20th century generation had died on the battlefields of World War I. What remained had to be preserved, but that a negative genetic impact had been caused by the war upon the so-called Volk, or the collective body of the nation. In his book Mein Kampf, Hitler writes, "Whoever is not bodily and spiritually healthy and worthy shall not have the right to pass on his suffering within the bodies of his children." In Hitler's so-called, not very imaginatively titled, second book, a sequel to Mein Kampf, which was written in 1928 but never published in his lifetime because publishers advised against it. In this book, he also muses on eugenics. He says Sparta must be regarded as the first folkish state. The exposure of the sick, weak, deformed children, in short, their destruction, was more decent and in truth 1,000 times more humane than the wretched insanity of our day, which preserves the most pathological subject, and indeed at any price, and yet takes the life of 100,000 healthy children in consequence of birth control or through abortions, in order subsequently to breed a race of degenerates burdened with illnesses. And then came 1933. Immediately after Hitler's inauguration, the Reich Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick established a so-called Expert Advisory Committee for Population and Racial Policy, on which sat Alfred Plutz, whom we discussed earlier. And on July the 14th of 1933, Frick imposed the so-called Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring, otherwise known as the Sterilization Law, which enforced then compulsory sterilization for people with supposedly genetical illnesses, including alcoholism, so-called imbecility, schizophrenia, Huntington's cholera, epilepsy, blindness, deafness, and deformity. And this law would also enforce sterilization upon the approximately 400 mixed-race German children, known as the so-called Rhineland bastards, the children of German civilians and French African soldiers who had been part of the occupation of the Rhineland after World War I. And by this sterilization law, physicians were compelled to register cases of so-called hereditary illness known to them. In the case of people who were pregnant and regarded then to be unsuitable for reproduction, huge numbers of abortions were performed. Abortion in Nazi Germany, in fact, was legal and actually compulsory, but only under these circumstances. The sterilization law also allowed for the creation of what were called Erbgesundheitsgerichte, or genetic health courts, of which there would be over 200 established by 1945. This is one in the city of Cologne. And from this point on, around 5,000 people per month would be forcibly sterilized in Germany. Residents of nursing homes, asylums, prison inmates, and children with special needs were examined before the court to determine their suitability. And in 1934, the genetic health courts would oversee 84,600 trials and order 62,400 forced sterilizations. Approximately 4,000 appeals were made in that year against the court's decisions. Almost all would fail. In 1935, the court saw 88,100 trials and ordered 71,700 sterilizations. In total, about 360,000 Germans were sterilized before the outbreak of World War II. In 1934, a prominent eugenicist from California called Charles Matthias Goethe reported back from Germany to a colleague, "Everywhere I sensed that their opinions have been tremendously stimulated by American thought. I want you, my dear friend, to carry this thought with you for the rest of your life, that you have really jolted into action a great government of 60 million people." Harry Hamilton Laughlin, superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office in New York and one of the most prominent of American eugenicists, spoke about his delight, he said, on the common understanding of German and American scientists. And then in 1939, the American eugenicist, early KKK member and coiner of the term Underman, from which the German Untermensch was derived, Lothrop Stoddard, travelled to Germany as a journalist for the American Newspaper Alliance. He reported back on his experiences witnessing a day's worth of trials before a health court in the Charlottenburg neighborhood of Berlin. He saw, he claimed, an ape-like man, a manic depressive, a deaf-mute girl, and a girl suffering mental retardation be sentenced to be sterilized. He regarded the Nazis' proceedings as scientific and truly humanitarian, albeit, if anything, too lenient. Also in 1933, the so-called, and it's quite a mouthful, National Socialist German Workers' Party Office for Enlightenment on Population Policy and Racial Welfare, later renamed the Office of Racial Policy, would be founded under Dr. Walter Gross, who would die by suicide in April 1945. Gross claimed that both the Nuremberg laws, which of course restricted the rights of German Jews, and this new sterilization law were vital for Germany's future survival. Gross's new organization was chiefly responsible for producing propaganda which pertained to so-called racial hygiene, and especially for stoking anxiety about the supposed greater fecundity of the inferior. In other words, that undesirable Germans were supposedly reproducing at much greater rates than those deemed to be desirable. So propaganda identified disability as a real, clear and present threat to the collective and hereditary health of the German people. In 1935, an exhibition called Wonders of Life was installed in Berlin and hypothesized on the demographic consequences of this supposed inconsistency in birth rates. The exhibit reads, "This is how it will end if inferiors produce 4 children and superiors 2. A similar image here. Propaganda also made clear allusions to the supposed personal cost borne by working and middle-class Germans for each disabled person. This poster reads, "Every day a congenitally ill person costs the state 5 Reichsmarks 50. On 5 Reichsmarks 50, a congenitally healthy family can live for 1 day." And this is a page from a school mathematics textbook asking school children, what is the cost of caring for the hereditarily ill? 1 year in hospital costs 3,000 Reichsmarks. For that, 2 workers have to sacrifice their annual wage. 7 years in an educational institution, 4 workers. 10 years in an asylum, 10 workers. This poster reads, "You're carrying them along. A congenitally ill person costs, on average, 50,000 Reichsmarks before reaching the 60th year of life." The second image is captioned, "60,000 Reichsmarks, the cost of this congenitally ill person to the people's community throughout his lifetime. Comrade, this is your money." This is in fact an advertisement for a monthly magazine called the Neues Volk, or New People, produced by the Office of Racial Policy. The magazine had a circulation of around 300,000 and it was purchased privately or by libraries, as well as being available in physicians' waiting rooms. It was of course preoccupied by so-called racial hygiene in terms of disseminating images and articles about Aryan identity, the Hitler Youth, the supposed excellence of the Germans, the deficiencies of Jews and Slavs, and so on. It also juxtaposed images of mentally incapacitated children with those deemed to be healthy. It criticized Aryans who did not reproduce. It discussed the importance of traditional naming and raising of children, and reminded readers of the benefits of having many kids, including, for instance, the Mother's Cross awarded to women with large numbers of children, and Hitler, well, theoretically becoming the honorary godfather of the 7th child of a family. This office also produced several propaganda films, some of which were short films. They were shown before feature-length movies in cinemas, including Das Erbe, or The Inheritance, from 1935. And in this 12-minute movie, directed by Carl C. Hartmann and aimed at legitimizing the sterilization law, a teacher begins by discussing the struggle for existence by instigating 2 stag beetles to fight one another, and to that a young blonde female student who's really called Fräulein Volkmann, no joke, responds, "Animals actually pursue a racial policy." And after that, the short film shows footage of asylum patients. It discusses the tragedy of disability and promotes the idea of carefully choosing a partner and avoiding hereditary disease. The success of these short films contributed to the production of a feature-length sound movie in 1937 called Opfer der Vergangenheit, or Victims of the Past, and this was shown in every cinema throughout Germany with graphic footage from inside insane asylums. In 1941, the film Ich klage an, I accuse, directed by Wolfgang Lieberneiner, would be produced, and this tells the story of a beautiful young woman suffering from multiple sclerosis and begging doctors to end her life. In the end, her husband, who is himself a doctor, gives her a fatal overdose and then makes a long speech at trial about how prolonging some lives is contrary to nature and is in fact, he says, an act of cruelty. Now we are indeed moving from talking about sterilization to talking about euthanasia, mass murder, which you might say was perhaps an inevitable, but it was a gradual, nevertheless, development throughout the Nazi era. Although mass sterilization did begin as early as 1933, it would still be several years before the Nazis began to institute a program of mass murder of the disabled. Now, of course, we could say that the Nazis' degeneration into abject violence was, to some degree at any rate, a gradual process, but there really are three reasons why the sterilization of the disabled didn't lead immediately to mass killing. One is Nazi Germany needed those people. It would suffer from acute labour shortages between 1933 and 1939, due largely to rearmaments and also to the reorganisation of the German population, to some degree too to mass incarceration, of course. Second reason that even for the Nazis as well, their second most prominent spokesman, Joseph Goebbels, was himself disabled. I suppose even the Nazis couldn't be seen to be too overtly hypocritical. And the third reason, believe it or not, and it really is a grotesque truth about the Nazis, is that they really were very concerned with German public opinion, and they understood that mass murder of hospital patients would be unacceptable to the majority of the German people in 1933, at least if they were to know about it. Now, during trials later, perpetrators did say Hitler had spoken to them about the mass killing of the disabled as early as 1933, but believed it would be more opportune to carry this out during wartime when people's attention would be otherwise occupied. And well, indeed, in October of 1939, it seems Hitler felt the time was ready to authorize physicians to implement the mass killing program, backdating, though, this edict to September the 1st. This letter reads, Reichsleiter Bouhler and Dr. Brandt are assigned to be professionally accountable to extend the legal authority of special medical doctors so that they may be able to permit euthanasia to incurably sick patients after most strenuous critical adjudication of their medical condition. Well, this concept of strenuous critical adjudication proved to be open to some interpretation. Let me first describe a very curious and very tragic case which will precipitate this order of Hitler's by a few months. In February 1939, a boy was born named Gerhard Kretschmar. He was born severely disabled. He was blind. He was born without legs and I believe with one arm. And his father, Richard, took his son then to the University Children's Clinic in Leipzig to ask for the baby to be euthanized, but he was told that this was illegal. So Richard, then the father, wrote directly to Hitler to petition for the child, to whom he referred as a monster, to be euthanized. Hitler then granted permission for one of his personal physicians, Karl Brandt, to evaluate the situation and, if needs be, to carry out the killing. Karl Brandt then killed the baby with a lethal injection, most likely of a commonly available drug like phenobarbital. His death, though, was recorded to have been the result of heart failure. Perhaps, or so it seems, the death of this baby seems to have opened the floodgates for what would follow. Certainly within 3 weeks of Kretschmar's death, August 18th, 1939, the so-called Reich Committee for the Scientific Registering of Hereditary and Congenital Illnesses was established, and by this, doctors were ordered to begin systematically registering severely disabled children, and a panel was assembled to assess which children should be killed. Between late 1939 and 1941, over 5,000 children had been euthanized and had been killed in this way. Let's talk about the two most significant perpetrators here, the two co-chiefs of the T4 program. Karl Brandt was a German doctor and an SS officer who became one of Hitler's personal doctors in 1934 and was part of his inner circle regularly at the Reich Chancellery, Berghof. He held the title Reich Commissioner of Sanitation and Health and would carry out huge numbers of abortions following the passing of that so-called law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, or the sterilization law we discussed earlier. Karl Brandt would later be a defendant at the doctor's trial that would take place in Nuremberg from 1946 to 7. He was in fact defended by Robert Savasius, who would go on later to defend Adolf Eichmann. He was sentenced to death and he was executed at Landsberg prison. Philipp Bouhler was a World War I veteran. He was a senior Nazi Party functionary and an SS officer who served as the chief of Hitler's Reich Chancellery and was put in charge of T4 alongside Brandt. He and his wife Helena would be arrested on May 10th, 1945 by American troops, and both would die in custody, Helena by jumping from a window and Bouhler with a hidden capsule of cyanide. Hitler issued this edict permitting mass euthanasia, involuntary euthanasia that is, in October of 1939, but backdated it to September 1st, the day on which Germany declared war on Poland, the day we would now regard as the outbreak of the Second World War. And the outbreak of war, it seems, provided sufficient distraction from this murderous new policy. And as war went on, it would also desensitize people ever more to murder on an unprecedented and industrial scale, and it would also reduce, it seems, sympathies for minority groups ever further. The psychologist and neurologist Hermann van Müller, who would become a so-called assessor of disabled patients, determining whether they should live or die, would say, following the outbreak of the war, "It's unbearable to me that the flower of our youth must lose their lives on the front line, while the feeble-minded and asocial element may have a secure existence in the asylum." And so this is what we'll talk about in the next installment of this talk, in the second video, part 2, when we move from discussing sterilization to talking about, indeed, euthanasia in more detail, mass murder, where and how and when it took place, and who would then fall victim to this operation, as it was called, T4. Again, it most certainly will not be an easy discussion, but I hope that you'll join me for that as well. And thank you very, very much for being here with me and listening today.